Hollywood has made some wonderful films with the Pacific Northwest as the scenic backdrop. Today, we chat with a film historian and critic that just may have you taking a few detours in your RV to seek out some famous filming locations that are right here in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to RV Out West. I'm your host, Brooks. My Family of Four's base camp is located in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and our RV adventures radiate out from there. Please grab a mug of coffee and join us as we discuss RVing around the American West. From sweet camping spots, gear and equipment, to tips and tricks, we've got you covered. We are RV Out West. Both big production studio filmmakers and those who make smaller independent films have often used the surrounding beauty of the Pacific Northwest as locations for their movies. For those of us who live here, we probably understand as to the why. Yet, it's probably the reason that we search out fun destinations to travel to in our RVs. The dramatic ecosystems are a draw for so many of us to go and see, and that is the reason alone as to why movies are made in this bioregion. Joining us on RV Out West is a longtime film critic and historian, Robert Horton, a Seattle native and film buff who has spent his entire career in the movie industry. We chat about all sorts of filming locations, and our conversation just may inspire you to seek out some of these locations on your upcoming RV season. Robert, thank you so much for joining us here on RV Out West. I really appreciate it.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so first off, why don't we go ahead and jump in? Will you tell me a little bit just about yourself and kind of how you got involved in the film industry, and a little bit about where you're from, and just kind of a quick little brief bio?
I'm a film critic and historian, and I've been that way for a while. I was born and raised in Seattle and have written for newspapers there for a long time, and kind of got into teaching about film through that. I'm a member of the National Society of Film Critics. I regularly teach classes. Every once in a while, I get to travel to a film festival somewhere in the world and be on a jury. You know how film festivals give awards and that kind of thing. And I've been able to do that a few times, which is a funny experience. And I stand up and give talks. I'm a public speaker. I've had For a while, I was with Smithsonian Journeys as a speaker, and I was giving talks on cruise ships, which led me to a lot of interesting places and meeting interesting people. And so film has been my thing. And as you can maybe hear, it's led to a lot of unusual diversions. And among them have been occasionally writing about the very subject that you're talking about, not with an emphasis on RV travel necessarily, but with the subject of where things were shot in the vicinity, especially around Seattle, where I'm from, but other places too. So I've written a few articles about that, and I was able to about 12 years ago or so, I was able to curate an exhibition at Seattle's City History Museum, which is called the Museum of History and Industry, MOHI.
Yeah,
It's a
Mohai's
wonderful place.
great.
Oh yeah, it's such a great place. And they had a big exhibit on Seattle and film, and the idea was both how has Seattle been presented in the movies, and also how have people gone to the movies in Seattle. Lots of stuff on old theaters, some of which were not there anymore. But yeah, we got to talk about some of the filming locations and got a few props in from various films that were shot in Seattle. So it's a subject I like a lot, and it's I think it's always really kind of fun to talk about where they shot this and where they shot that.
What kind of led you to becoming a film critic and film historian? Was there kind of what led to this as a career choice and a lifelong passion and pursuit? I'm very curious.
I guess it probably just has to do with the lifelong passion part of it, because I really liked movies when I was a kid growing up. I started to like writing too when I got into college, and so I fell in with some people who were showing films in Seattle. It was called the Seattle Film Society, and we would we would literally raise a giant screen in an old refurbished church and project movies on 16 millimeter from, the projection booth in the back and take tickets and write the newsletter. And that sort of cemented my interest in it. And somehow I just found that I really liked writing, and writing about movies was a good way to do it. It's a great way to express yourself and to use your word. Follow your passion, and be able to engage with people, which this allowed me to do.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into how Hollywood has had an impact in the Pacific Northwest. And, not just in Seattle, I think, we can talk about the Pacific Northwest. And, I think many RVers know that Astoria and the Goonies house is kind of one of the big famous stomping grounds to maybe some of those boomer listeners who might remember Officer and a Gentleman, being filmed out at Fort Worden in Port Townsend. Singles for those Gen Xers was filmed up on Capitol Hill, or at least the main house. But outside of that, let's talk about, what are some locations? So if an RVer is cruising around here in the Pacific Northwest and they're looking for something different to go check out, what are some other film sites and filming locations?
Certainly, one of the most famous locations in Washington State is anything that has to do with Twin Peaks. That sort of becomes solidified as a real. I mean, there's an actual tourist trail, that you can follow, and you go to the town of North Bend, which is where the cafe that was the site of cherry pie and the coffee that the character played by Kyle MacLachlan likes so much. And there's also the Salish Lodge at Snoqualmie Falls, which features both as a setting and as the backdrop for the falls that you would see in the opening credits always of that show. And to get a little more hardcore, there's a place in Paulsbo, Washington, called the Kiana Lodge, and that's really dear to the hearts of Twin Peaks people, because it's the beach in front of it is where Laura Palmer's body was found, which started off the whole storyline, and various other shots taken inside and outside of that place. So you sort of have to start with Twin Peaks, just because, as you said, there are places that are kind of well known, and that's one of them, that are really unavoidable, and that have created their own. It's like a little cottage industry almost, and so it is fun when you go to the cafe in North Bend, because if you want to get if not only if you want to sit there and have coffee and cherry pie, but you can walk away with some souvenirs and various kinds of merch and T-shirts that will solidify the fact that you actually did stop there.
And Laura Palmer's house filming location is here in Everett.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's a long history too, because of course David Lynch, the late great David Lynch, just did his third season a few years ago, and went back to that very house to get the exterior of that. Yeah, that Twin Peaks, that's quite a saga. So that's for specialists, I guess.
And it's timely too, just because of David Lynch's passing too. So
That's true. So we kind of had to mention it.
yeah, absolutely.
There's those places, to speak of, another phenomenon that actually did have an impact on tourism and such. The Twilight books and the movies that came after that, at least for a while, they were a great boon for the town of Forks, Washington, over there on the coast. I remember reading somewhere that the author Stephanie Meyer decided to set it there because she Googled what is the place that has the least amount of sunshine in the United States, and apparently it was Forks, which is a pretty dubious honor. Although it's kind of a nice place to visit, actually. But yeah, you can go there, and they actually shot some of it on the Oregon coast too. Oregon's, as a state, has been pretty good about creating kind of a movie tourist trail, even putting up signs in places like Cannon Beach to lead you to, here's the spot where the characters from Twilight did their thing.
The other big thing about that area in Cannon Beach too, right, is the rock and kind of that final scene in Goonies as the ship is coming out of the back from behind after the kids found the treasure. So Another one that made Cannon Beach.
Yeah, and some of these places they're funny because there's a reason that Hollywood chooses certain spots. And obviously, if you've ever been to Cannon Beach, and everybody should go to Cannon Beach at some point because it's a wonderful, wonderful place. You can with Haystack Rock there, you can see why a movie company would want to shoot something with that as your backdrop. I mean, it's hard to get more dramatic than that. So yeah, that one's popped up in a few movies along the way, and rightly so. The other thing, the other obscurity, if you're going to Astoria, that is overshadowed probably by the Goonies stuff that people are going to look for. That was the location. That was where they shot Kindergarten Cop. Do you remember Schwarzenegger in,
I do remember. And they also
yeah,
shot Free Willy there.
Free Willy? Yes, that was the backdrop for a bunch of Free Willy stuff. Yeah, I love the idea of, I totally understand why Twin Peaks cultists would go travel around North Bend or something, but I kind of like imagining that there's somebody who just really loves Kindergarten Cop, and they're a cult of one person or two people or something. But by golly, they're gonna have to find the school where they shot Arnold Schwarzenegger in that movie. Down there in Oregon, let's just cite. I know that when I was growing up, one of the legendary movie sites in Oregon was in Eugene, which was the backdrop for Animal House, which was a huge, huge hit. Practically defined the culture for a while. There's so many knockoffs of that movie, and it probably affected the way people had parties at colleges for many years too. But yeah, that movie was shot down there. John Belushi and company going there to shoot both the interiors and the exteriors. And I had to look this up because I knew we were going to talk about this, and apparently the frat house that was the Delta House of that movie has been demolished. Conjures up such a vivid sense of place in that movie that I guess you have to look for some other spots around there. So one of the most famous athletes to ever come out of Eugene was Steve Prefontaine, the great runner who died at a unfortunately very young age. And there were two movies made about his life that came out pretty close to each other. One was Without Limits. The other, I think, it's just called Prefontaine.
Free.
Is it just pre? Yeah, that's why I was pausing there. And so you get a little dose of like '60s era Eugene being recreated in that film, which is also fun.
On that note, you can go visit Pre's Rock. I've been to that one. There's flowers and there's a little bit of like a memorial there where Pre turned the corner and ultimately wrecked his Austin Healey and died.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's one of those great things. I once visited the spot where James Dean died in his car, so I get there's a whole sub genre of traveling you could do. But not to get overly morbid, but for those of us who are interested in that. I have never visited this place, but in the movie Five Easy Pieces, there's a scene in a diner where Jack Nicholson becomes upset with the waitress who won't make a substitution in his order. And if you've ever seen this movie, and it became kind of a cultural artifact, this great scene. And that scene was shot in a Denny's outside of Eugene. It's just outside of town, and apparently it's still there. And that's actually a pilgrimage that I would go on. I would sort of pay homage to that scene without knocking anything over, which he does in that sequence.
What about in Portland?
Portland has had a pretty good run, yeah, and they've both as a backdrop for movies. But the thing that impresses me about, I mean, of course, there was also Portlandia, the TV show, which people know if they know about Portland at all. But Portland has a very good collection of filmmakers who tend, and in this case, tend to be out just slightly outside the mainstream, even though they use Hollywood money sometimes. I'll just mention them because they're also interesting. Gus Van Sant, who made Drugstore Cowboy.
Oh, that was a great movie.
Yeah, now that's shot around Portland itself.
Okay.
He's made a lot of other movies outside of Portland, but I think he still lives in Portland. And yeah, My Own Private Idaho is another one of his films that's using Portland locations. There's a great filmmaker who's one of my favorites of right now of the independent scene, and her name is Kelly Reichardt, and she lives in Portland, and she almost always bases her films in Portland or in Oregon and just outside. So you will see a lot of Portland in her movies. Like she made a movie called Showing Up that's came out a couple of years ago that's got a really nice feel for place. She made a Western called Meek's Cutoff that's shot in the Oregon desert, which is an interesting place that people might not always think of when they think of Oregon. There's so many locations. We associate, maybe Oregon with green and the forests, but the whole eastern side of the state is pretty interesting. The third filmmaker that I would mention is Todd Haynes, who has made a lot of fairly prominent, award-winning films in recent years, but he has had Portland as his home base too for a while. So the scene in Portland is quite strong. I would actually say it's probably a little bit stronger than Seattle in terms of having these very notable filmmakers who have really made a huge impression on especially the independent scene.
And then Spokane, I'm only familiar with that movie Tag about the friends in high school who have been playing a never-ending game of tag that was based out of guys from Spokane. So there was a lot of Spokane scenes.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. I that has a kind of a cult following too, doesn't it, Tag?
Yeah, it's this silly comedy with, Rob Reiner.
You just pre-associating, you just mentioned Rob Reiner, and of course he lays claim to being one of the most famous Seattle movies, Sleepless in Seattle. This still gets people coming around looking at locations. Rob Reiner and Tom Hanks down in the Pike Place Market in Seattle and having lunch at the Athenian restaurant, which is still there, kind of a landmark of the market. But yeah, there have been a lot of movies shot around the Pike Place Market. That's another very scenic spot that lends itself to that.
And they also shot a lot of Sleepless in Seattle right over in Alki, along Alki Beach, and
That's right.
kind of
Yeah.
looking back on the city from West Seattle.
Yes, it's a great spot for shooting something because you get the look back at the city. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. I was going to mention the Space Needle because it's kind of unavoidable. And if you want to see the Space Needle starring in a movie, you should watch the opening sequence of The Parallax View, which is a '70s movie with Warren Beatty. And there's a political assassination that happens there. And it's a really amazing film. If you are on any kind of an Elvis trail while you are hunting for movie locations, he didn't um, he didn't travel that much outside of LA when he shot his films, but he did come to Seattle for It Happened at the World's Fair, for the Seattle World's Fair. And so you can, go up and have a meal at the Space Needle. And there's a scene where Elvis does that in that movie. And there's this, you can also ride the monorail, which will take you to the Seattle Center where the World's Fair was. There's a scene where Elvis sings a song on the monorail as well, which the ride, it only takes you about as long as it would take Elvis to sing about a 2.5 minute song. But still, if you're an Elvis completist, you might want to make those stops on your tour.
So let me ask you, I'm going to kind of transition away from the Pacific Northwest. Since we are an RV podcast, I'd like to talk to you about what you think are some of the greatest road trip movies. And they don't have to be filmed in the Pacific Northwest. Like if we were talking books, I would throw out On the Road with Jack Kerouac and Travels with Charlie, which is personally by John Steinbeck, which is one of my favorites. What would you say are some like quintessential road trip films that are the equivalent in film?
Gee, I love road movies. I'm trying to think of one that has, so many of the road movies that I think of in a weird way, they end with in disaster or something like that. So I'm trying to oh, I don't know, Thelma and Louise, for instance,
Right?
comes to mind, and also the film. Oh, what's the movie that Sean Penn directed about the guy who goes to Alaska and dies?
Oh,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
flashing on.
Into the
I'm
Wild, which is based off of John
Yeah,
Krakauer, a Seattle author, his book.
yeah. That movie actually does. It's of course it's terribly sad, but it actually does capture a sense of being on the road really well.
It does. I would agree with that. And it's
It's a bit of a bummer.
it's beautifully shot too.
It really is. Yeah, that whole thing kind of holds together as one piece. There are some road movies that, well, actually, Five Easy Pieces, of course, which we mentioned earlier in regard to it has some Northwest locations, and that is quite a road movie, sort of one of those existential journeys, not unlike the Kerouac was probably sort of inspired by that. It Happened One Night is a great road movie. That's the Frank Capra film from the '30s. won a bunch of Oscars. Two people getting on the road. Do they have to be? Let's see. Should they be American road movies or
No,
can
I'm
they
gonna
be
open it up
foreign
to
films?
whatever, just road movies. I mean,
There's this great film that was directed by the German director Wim Wenders, who has since gone on to have a very distinguished career. And the movie is called Kings of the Road. That's the American title. And it's one of the best movies about being on the road that I've ever seen because it really gets into the kind of weird rhythm that totally changes your metabolism if you start just being on the road for a while. And it's kind of a wonderful movie that popped into my head as meant a lot to me at the time, and maybe it even captures some of the feeling of that song, King of the Road, the great Roger Miller song.
okay. Well, let me ask you this. This is the really important question.
Let's get down to it.
If you were only allowed to have one piece of candy when you watch a movie, what's your go-to movie candy?
That is very important. Yeah. I'm into chocolate now, but I have to say that my sentimental choice from childhood would be
Oh,
dots.
excellent choice.
Those I just there's something about dots that I really liked as a kid, and they have never gone out of fashion with me. So that's going to be my go-to, I think, if
Good
I
answer.
the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah.
I want to talk to you about film houses in Seattle. So,
Oh,
like, if
great. Yeah.
somebody's looking for a really cool film house to go see an independent film or to see something different that's not in a major metroplex, where would you recommend they go check a movie out in both Seattle and Portland?
Seattle, boy, Seattle has lost a lot of its smaller art house cinemas lately. So the real action tends to be in the theaters that are now being run by the organization that runs the Seattle International Film Festival, otherwise known as SIFF, and they have the SIFF. One of their theaters is called the SIFF Uptown, and they have also taken over what used to be a Cinerama theater in downtown Seattle, which literally is one of the two or three places that can show three projector cinerama. If people remember this from the 1950s, where you have to be running three projectors at the same time to show the whole movie. Won't get into the details with that, but they are showing good movies there and doing kinds of revivals and showing 70 millimeter and things like that. Both good places. I'm on the board of directors of Scarecrow Video, so I'm going to throw in a plug to if you're a movie fan, you should make a pilgrimage to Scarecrow Video, which has the largest collection of accessible and rentable movies pretty much anywhere on the planet. Portland is blessed with a lot of terrific independent movie theaters. In fact, I'll just mention there's the Hollywood, which is shows all kinds of things, revivals and older films and new films and foreign films, and they're even associated with another very good video store called Movie Madness, and then also the Baghdad Theater. I haven't gone there yet, purchased by the McMinimans chain, so you can also go and get a good meal there and get a beer and stuff with your movie.
Let me ask you, my final question now is, where can people go and follow along on your film related adventures and learn more about you?
Well, if anybody's interested, I do have a website of my own that I just sort of maintain with links to some of my writings and if I'm doing some guest speaking somewhere. And it's called The Crop Duster, named after the scene in North by Northwest with Cary Grant. And you can find it at roberthorton.wordpress.com.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us here on RV Out West. It's been a real pleasure talking to you about films and the film industry and the impact Hollywood has had, or the impact that the Pacific Northwest has had on Hollywood.
Yeah, vice versa. Yeah. Yeah, it's been fun talking to you too.
Thank you again for listening to RV Out West. I sincerely appreciate it. If you liked this episode, please share it with your family and friends. I'd also like to invite you to follow RV Out West on Instagram and Facebook, where you can join in on the conversation. Next week, we catch up with Thomas of Camper Alerts, and we are going to dive into some of his favorite camping locations all around Washington State, as well as in Oregon. Thomas and his wife are active RVers who are always on the lookout for cool destinations. Plus, he's going to share some fun new updates that he's made with Camper Alerts bioregion.com. It's going to be a great episode that you'll definitely want to tune into. Thanks so much for listening to RV Out West. Join us again next week. Please like and subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you choose to get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. I sure would appreciate it if you left a rating or a review of the show. Special thanks to Scott Holmes Music for providing us the intro song, We Are One. RV Out West can be found on Instagram and Facebook, where you can interact with us and follow along on our RV adventures around the Pacific Northwest. So get out there, explore, and go see what's beyond the horizon.